The 3-1 Utah Utes are set to take on the 3-1 Oregon State Beavers at Rice-Eccles Stadium this Saturday. But what are the biggest storylines in this matchup, and what does Utah need to do to get a win? We're talking about it on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone. My name is JT Wistrcill, former student intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We greatly appreciate it here. Make sure you guys head over, like, and subscribe on YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. On today's show, going to be going over the biggest storylines going into this matchup. And in order to help me do that, friend of the show, Spencer Mclaughlin, host of the Locked On Pac-12 podcast. And Spencer, this is a fun one. I mean, you're looking at a Beavers team that almost upset USC recently, and now coming into this game, I mean, it's a game last year where they did, of course, upset the Utah Utes. So I think the biggest thing I'm excited to see is, can this Utah passing game keep the momentum going? They've been steadily improving each game. Devon Vele has had his best 2 games of the season most recently. And you look at Brant Keithy being out, so you have him to replace as well as a really talented Oregon State secondary. So I think it's going to be fun to see what Cam Rising and this group can do against the best secondary and in general, just the best team they've played since they took on the Florida Gators. But really, that secondary, I think, is a really good challenge for this group.
Yeah, I got to amend your statement a little bit there, JT. Not almost upset USC, should have
Yes,
upset
true.
USC. That is a game that Oregon State should have won. Not could have, not had the chance to, and let it get away, which they certainly did. They should have won that game. The difference here, though, is this game's being played in Salt Lake City, and I'm with you 100%. The Oregon State secondary is probably the best in the Pac-12. I think you'd have to put USC's up there just because they've been forcing so many turnovers, led by Mekhi Blackman, and that's been really the focal point of their defense. Is that they've allowed a decent amount of yards, but they're forcing turnovers. They picked off Chance Nolan 4 times. They picked off Tanner McKee twice. They forced turnovers against Fresno State and against Rice in their season opener. They lead the country in turnovers. And so Oregon State now comes in with a mindset of, we got to protect the football better, because when you go on the road at Utah, you can't make those sorts of mistakes and hang around in the game. Oregon State played well enough to win, but they were at home. If you play like that and you're that sloppy and careless with the football and you go on the road, one turnover is going to feel like 1.5 or 2. It always, problems compound themselves when you are on the road. And so I don't think Oregon State has room for error in that front. But this Beaver secondary, make no mistake, they're nasty. They've got a new defensive coordinator who was on staff last year. They promoted from within, which isn't typically what you would do when you fire a defensive coordinator. But they got rid of Tim Tibesar, a change that needed to be made, and they promote Trent Bray, their linebackers coach, this season to go from within. The results so far have been really good. They're the only team to hold USC under 40 points this year, and they held them under 20.
Yes.
I don't care if Caleb Williams on an individual level defensive side wasn't having his best game. You got to give the Oregon State defense a lot of credit. But again, they did that at home. And coming into the season, I thought that was ripe for an upset. I thought it going into last week, and I went on Locked On Pac-12 and I picked the upset. Should have happened. I'm kind of bummed it didn't, because I was like,
We
man,
talked about this podcast too, actually. Yeah.
I did. Yeah. And it was right there. They had a chance, but Chance Nolan threw 4 interceptions. So he's a guy who I think is going to be motivated to come out and perform better, because he's capable of doing that coming into it. But I expect Utah to have a pretty ground-centric approach offensively, because the strength of this Oregon State defense is that secondary, and they can make plays in the run as well. But you don't want to throw the ball up in the air with Rajon Wright and Jaden Grant out there looming. And the other 2 guys they've got are good players too. Across the board, there's really no weakness there. So I think that is an area where Cam Rising's got to be careful when he does let it go. But I expect the Utes to try and run the football here, because I think the Beavers' offensive line is improved, but still behind where Utah's offensive line is.
Yeah, and I think if you are Utah as well, you're disappointed in some ways with how you ran the ball against Arizona State because you look at it and yes, you rushed for over 200 yards, but there were some plays where there were critical third and ones, fourth and ones, and you didn't pick it up. And you took you four down sometimes just to get 10 yards. That's not something that's supposed to be the case for this Utah offense. There was a lot of weird stuff with Tavion Thomas going on last week as well. So just kind of the running game, at least for me, I know left a bad taste in my mouth. So I'm excited to see them try to get back and add it as well. But it is an interesting thing you talk about. Just look, when we have a lot of time to break down USC versus Utah over the next couple weeks, which is going to be a fun one as we are about 2 weeks away, a little over 2 weeks away from it. But you get those USC receivers. I mean, Jordan Addison, a lot of those other guys that's a more potent receiver room than Utah has. And those guys did struggle, as you mentioned, as well. And it is going to be interesting to see if the Utes can kind of create that separation.
Yeah, and it's not going to be an easy thing. The Utes are certainly capable, right? It's not as if they don't have talent out there, but football sometimes is really complicated. You have 22 moving pieces on any given play. Other times, football is really simple, and it just comes down to who wins in a 1v1 matchup. If Devon Vele's one on one with Rajon Wright, can he win the 1v1? I could not come on here and say definitively Vele's going to win more one-on-one route situations than Wright, but I couldn't come on here honestly and say it the other way, right? There are things that you just can't know, you can't always predict and be able to have a full understanding of exactly what's going to happen. There are those 50-50 situations. The ball bounces this way, the ball bounces that way. Turnovers, specifically fumbles, statistically in football are very random. Like there are a lot of things that go into the outcome of a football game. And I think for Utah offensively, the key to them moving the ball is, will Cam Rising be able to protect it? Historically, that's been the case since he became the Utes starting quarterback. And will they be able to win in one-on-one situations? Because this Oregon State defense, from what I've seen, they will play zone and they have a pretty good balance there. But they like playing man to man. From what I have seen from them, and I've watched Oregon State a good amount this year, they're not afraid to go one on one. And if you can create those situations when maybe they're bringing an extra guy down in the box to defend the run, or they're going cover zero because they're going to bring some pressure, is Utah going to be able to capitalize on those moments? I think it'll be the biggest question for the Utes offense is how do you separate against the best or second best secondary in the Pac-12?
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see who steps up. Wide receiver's been steadily improving each game. It feels like you obviously lose Brant Keithy, so Thomas Yasmin, the guy with the big 77-yard catch and run in that game, is he going to be able to take advantage of more opportunities? Is it going to be a guy like Money Parks who steps up? There's a lot of guys who are going to have an opportunity to stand out, as you mentioned as well. The running backs obviously should have a strong day. It's going to be interesting to see what the carry load kind of looks like because now there's four guys kind of in that mix, which Quinton Jackson getting some opportunities in the most recent game as well. So a fun opportunity for Utah on offense, the best team they have played by far, as I mentioned, since the Florida Gators. And there's even in some ways this team will test them in better ways than Florida will. And we're going to talk about what those are in just a second. But first, I want to tell you guys about betonline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. Find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and depth articles and analysis every single game, as well as with BetOnline, guys. You can bet on sports outside of football, MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. And of course, if you do just want to bet on football, BetOnline absolutely has you covered. Tons of great games coming up this weekend at both the college and NFL level. So make sure you guys head over to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. And staying with BetOnline here, Spencer, is Utah is favored in this one by 10.5. What do you think of that line?
I think it's about right.
Mhm.
And the only reason that I say that is not because I don't think Oregon State is a good team. I do. I just watched Utah play at home, and I say that's a really tough environment to go to. And Utah is still, in my view, the best team in the Pac-12 until another team proves otherwise. I think USC is right behind them, certainly, and then Oregon and Washington are in the mix, and we'll see how UCLA performs against the Huskies this week. That's a big, big, big game
Mhm.
in the Pac-12. One of just two games this week that are single-digit point spreads. It's UCLA hosting Washington, where the Huskies are 3-point road favorites, and then you've got Cal going at Washington State, where the Cougars are 4-point home favorites. Everything else, a double digits point spread this week. I think the home teams that are favored, and of the four big lines, they're all at home. I think you're going to see those teams win pretty comfortably. And I feel that way about the Utes as well. I think they're going to cover that 10.5. It's not an indictment of Oregon State. I don't think anyone's going to be able to win in Salt Lake City this year. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think anybody won in Salt Lake City last year.
I don't think anyone's won in Salt Lake since I want to say 2018. Actually, I came to Utah in 2019, and I haven't seen them lose a home game with fans in the stands. I
Right.
should as well. I think they lost one to COVID during
Yeah,
the COVID
that
year.
whole season's a wash. So I think Utah is going to play well, and I think Oregon State, though motivated in one sense, it's hard to come off of an emotional letdown like that because you have to go on the road to a hostile environment the week after you were that close to the biggest win in Jonathan Smith's tenure in year 5. I mean, for the Beavs, they're still building something that's really good, and they could be an 8 or 9 win team here in 2022 because they knocked off both Mountain West opponents thanks to the jack of all trades, Jack Coletto. And I think that they're still a good team, but this is still a really, really tough matchup. And when you were that close, I mean, they led for what, 98% of the game.
They were an offensive line push away from winning the game. If those offensive linemen don't push Caleb Williams, they more than likely
Yep.
go on to lose that game.
Yep, that's exactly right, and that's that sort of bounce a ball situation I was talking about earlier when looking at a football matchup between two otherwise tightly contested teams. And you had that last week. It was in Corvallis. That was the opportunity. I think Oregon State will play fine, but I think Utah gets a late cover this week against Oregon State.
Yeah, I feel the same way as well. So make sure you guys head over to BetOnline and cash in on that, as well as other games if you guys are looking to get in on some of the action across the college football or NFL slate. And one of the other things that makes this game interesting is just Oregon State is a really good team, but last year they were really bad on the road, 1-5. So they already matched the one win from last season. But as you mentioned, it was against Fresno State as well. And that's a good Fresno State team. It is, but it's a lot different when you're going on to take on one of the most hostile environments in the Pac-12. I think as well. Believe it's homecoming this weekend for Utah, so it's going to be a packed stadium, as it almost always is, based on the sellouts as well. So it's going to be a hostile environment, and this is a team, as you mentioned, that comes off the letdown of just losing that game so closely as well. So it is going to be interesting to see, can they come together and just do things they weren't able to do last year and win a road games in this conference.
Which is a tough thing to do. And Utah's home field advantage is perhaps the best example of that. Oregon's is very good. When Washington is rolling, they win a lot of their games up there at Husky Stadium. Those are probably your 3 most daunting environments in the conference. USC when they're good as well. Excuse me. I think they are all unique in the sort of crowd that they present in a way, but the underlying I think USC's is just a little bit below where Utah, Washington, and Oregon's are, but you can have some other good crowds, but you can't underestimate, and the betting lines always reflect this, right? That it's called home field advantage for a reason, and when you've got 50,000 plus screaming every time something good happens in your favor and making noise and making it tough on the other team, the reason that home field advantage is so big is because, like I mentioned earlier, you compound mistakes, right? Every turnover, every mistake, every sloppy moment, every penalty feels bigger on the road because then you have to deal with the noise. And I just feel really good about Utah at home this week.
Yeah, and I feel the same way as well. And one of the interesting things about this one is we talked about how Utes on the offense, what the biggest kind of matchup storyline we're looking is on that side. I think defensively, I'm excited to see this Utah front seven. It's a group that really struggled to stop the Florida Gators rushing attack, has been really strong since then, especially handling an Arizona State rushing attack. That's one of the strengths of that team still, and Utah was still able to really keep them in check, held them to a program low 6 rushing yards in the game. They're actually at negative rushing yards for most of that game as well. So really impressive
Jeez.
by the Utes in that one. But this is a really good test. This is an Oregon State team that has 3 running backs over 100 yards on the season as well. It's an offensive line that returns all 5 of its starters. I do expect Utah to pack the box. I think Cole Bishop has been doing a phenomenal job. I mean, for my money, the best safety in the Pac-12 right now. And I think when Utah does that, they pack the box. I think they are going to be able to stop OSU's rushing attack. And that's where it gets interesting because we did see Chance Nolan kind of turn the ball over in some of those second and long, third and long situations. And I really feel like if Utah can stop the run, that's what will help them win this game by more than 10 points.
So Chance Nolan's interceptions last week had 2 different looks to them. One of them was a 50-50 shot, and Mekhi Blackman made a hell of a football play.
Mhm.
I mean, his own guy, I forget which receiver he was throwing to, but he could have made the play, but Blackman made it. That was one of the turnovers. The other ones, and this is how you can get to Chance Nolan. He is not a comfortable guy in the pocket when there's any sort of pressure. You know, he tends to get a little bit of that jitterbug look to him, gets a little happy feet, and he forces throws just trying to get the ball out and avoid a sack at all costs. So for Utah, the key to turning him over is making him uncomfortable. And I think that does start with stopping the run, which is a tough thing to do. This is a very good Oregon State offensive line when it comes to run blocking. They were a little suspect in pass protection a week ago, which is why Nolan made some poor throws. But overall, it's a unit that is probably going to be motivated to show they're better than what they put on a week ago in Corvallis. But that's going to be a pretty critical matchup because if Oregon State can come out and do what Florida did, then they will. This is an offense that wants to be very balanced, that uses the run to set up the play action pass. That's fundamentally what they are. They're a run, play action shot sort of offense. And if you take away that rushing attack, you can limit what they want to do offensively and limit some of their best concepts if the rush is, not a real threat for them. But conversely, if you're not able to stop the run, they are perfectly comfortable having Chance Nolan throw 18 to 20 times in the entire game if that's all that's required of him. You're not going to see them force 35 throws like, no, we got to be putting the ball in the air more often. Jonathan Smith, the head coach, and Brian Lindgren, the offensive coordinator, if they can run the ball at a 4 to 5 yard per carry clip throughout the course of the game, you'll see them put it on the ground at a almost 2-to-1 ratio of how often they go to the air. Chance Nolan's progress as a quarterback is a reason that the Beavs are 3-1 and we're very nearly a 4-0 after last week's game. But he still has some room to grow, as we saw against USC. But they are not a run, or they're not a pass dominated offense. They want to run the ball first. And if the Utes cannot stop the run, then they'll get a heavy dose of it all game long.
Yeah, and that's what'll be interesting to see is if Utah's able to stop it with just their normal 6 guys in the box, if they need to bring 7, maybe even 8 in there, really try to pack it. And I'm excited to see how it's going to play out as well, because like you mentioned, it's an opportunity for if the Utes are able to do it, get some turnovers in Rice-Eccles Stadium, really get that place rocking as well. And just once again, if Utah wants to be a top 10 team and belong amongst the elite, they have to prove they can stop some of the best rushing attacks in the country. And that's what they're going to have an opportunity to do on Saturday. So it's going to be a fun one. One thing that was really fun about this previous weekend, Spencer, is we were able to get Pac-12 play officially underway. And I want to know, what was your biggest takeaway from the first week of conference action?
Oof. Colorado is as bad as I thought they might be. That team is now down to Owen McCown at quarterback. Arizona's in a nice spot as a program in terms of where they're at in their rebuild. They're 17.5 point favorites against Colorado in Tucson this week. It's like 17.5. That is such a bad place to be. So Carl Durrell is the next coach that's on the hot seat. Arizona State's imploding, but I think the biggest thing, JT, is that the Pac-12 is deeper than everybody thought because the reputation coming in justifiably. Pac-12 hasn't won a bowl game since Oregon's Rose Bowl victory in 2020, right? We've gone through an
Crazy.
entire pandemic, gotten out of it now, and the Pac-12 hasn't won a bowl game in that entire stretch, and that hurts the conference's reputation. And you look at the preseason polls, and USC was in there, Oregon was in there, Utah was in there. But now Washington has firmly placed themselves in that discussion. They're, I think, number 15 in the country, and they deserve it. They have looked that way through 4 games. Week in and week out, they are beating their other teams handily. Washington State should probably be a top 25 team. You lose narrowly to an Oregon team that's ranked in the top 15 and throttled BYU. And you went on the road and beat a then ranked Wisconsin team that you know is a solid program year in and year out. And yet the Cougs not getting that sort of respect. Oregon State has a case to be in the top 25, even with that close loss to USC. And it's tougher now because both have one loss, but teams have moved up in the rankings, Texas, when you play a really good team and you show that you can play them on equal footing.
Good point.
And these two Pac-12 schools, Oregon State, Washington State, not coincidentally, I think the ones getting left out of conference realignment discussion are not getting that same sort of respect. I mean, Oregon State beats two quality Mountain West opponents. They look the way they should against an FCS school, a good FCS school in Montana State that was just in the FCS National Championship game. And then you are literally one or two plays away from beating a top 10 USC team. I don't know how that's not a top 25 resume. What the voters are probably seeing as well, they're probably going to lose to Utah this week, which I think they will. And you're not going to put a 3-2 Pac-12 team who's got two victories over a Mountain West team in there. But Washington State, if they come back and beat Cal this week, I don't know why that's not a top 25 resume. But the fact that we're here, and I haven't even mentioned UCLA yet, who got off to a sluggish start going 3-0, but not looking very impressive, looked much better last week on the road against Colorado and played the way they should. We'll see how they match up with the Huskies on Friday night on ESPN. That's a big, big game for both programs, respectively. But look at the list of teams that I just laid out. And Arizona is no longer a rollover win. And Cal was able to knock off Arizona. You know their defense will be solid. It's just a matter of whether their offense can produce. And a week ago they did with Jaden Otto at 274 yards. So I think what you're seeing compared to last year is the teams that are close to the bottom of the conference have come up a level, right? Cal last year was off to a terrible start. They're off to a much better start this year. Arizona was an abysmal program for the last few years. Anybody want to play them and feel like you're confidently going to blow them out? Because I don't. I watched Jaden Delores slinging around the field to T Mac and Jacob Cowing. Like, they have some players now. They're not a great team yet, but they have more players than they did. So I think aside from Colorado, the depth in the conference is increasing, and it's been a really fun thing to watch so far. And we'll see how much those teams cannibalize one another. But other than Utah's loss to Florida, I don't know how much better the non-conference slate could have gone, along with Oregon maybe being more competitive against Georgia. But who is competitive
Exactly. I think
against Georgia?
I think in that and that one people 100% took it as more bad Oregon than good Georgia, and it's clearly been the case. It's really just more how good Georgia is this season. They are clearly
Yeah,
the best team
yeah,
in the country right now.
yeah, and that's not even debatable
Mhm.
through the first 4 weeks, and it looks like that's poised to continue. They've got weapons, they've got the defense, they've got everything that you need to win back-to-back national championships. And so, those two games, they were not great looks in week one. I went on Locked On Pac-12 and I said, look, after the first week, Pac-12 football brand took a hit, but it's done nothing but go up since then. Washington State punches Michigan State in the mouth and runs them off the field, basically. Oregon dismantles BYU, which Washington State goes on the road and beats Wisconsin.
It's a
You're
huge.
beating I mean, that's a win against a good future Big 12 and current independent school in BYU that gets a lot of respect. I'm sorry, Utes fans, they're a good program.
Well, they
I
are.
Yeah. Well, I know. I've
Right.
come to
No, most
realize
people
there's
want to just like dump on him all the time, but like,
yes,
I,
yes.
you're being reasonable. You can't ignore what Kalani Sitake has built over there.
No, he's been a head coaching rumor for a number of
I know.
vacancies, including Oregon's this offseason, by the way, and for good reason. The guy's a good football coach. You beat Wisconsin, which is a perennial top 25 team in the Big Ten, on the road. And then Washington at home doesn't beat Michigan State. They run them off the field.
Mhm.
They were absolutely dynamic and explosive, and they were the better team from the jump there in Seattle. So there have been some really notable wins and some other games that are just not that bad of losses. Arizona State is has fallen off a cliff now, but they weren't all bad against Oklahoma State. I think the depth of the Pac-12 is stronger even than I thought it would be coming into this season. I thought Oregon State, Washington State would be better than last year. I thought they would be improved. And I think they're just a touch better even than I expected them to be. And Oregon State got that win at Fresno State. And, if that's a game that the Beavers lose, then people look and go, oh, look, another Mountain West team beating a Pac-12 school. Well, last year in a bowl game, Oregon State lost to Utah State. They lost to a Mountain West school. This week, they went 2-0 against two teams that are perennial contenders in the Mountain West in Boise State and Fresno. So I think the depth has really, really elevated for the Pac-12 this season so far.
I 100% agree. Also love that you started with Colorado at first because I was like, there's so many positives with this conference, and you're just be like, yeah, Colorado is
I
the
did.
best.
I had to get that out of the way. I feel for the Buffs, man. It's
I do
just
too.
it's tough times, and I thought they'd struggle coming into the year.
Mhm.
My preseason win total prediction for them was 1-11, and
But you just thought they'd be more competitive?
Yeah, I thought it'd be a more competitive 111, right? I said, look, I don't think you get rid of Darrell if that plays itself out, because I figured they'd be a little bit better, but I don't see anything they have to feel good about, right? What are you optimistic about if you're a Colorado fan? Is it that you've seen 3 different quarterbacks start and none of them appear capable to lead the offense as presently constructed to a successful scoring output on a weekly basis? Or is it that the defense has shown no ability to stop anyone at any point in time? Do you know what Zach Charbonnet's stat line was last week, JT?
I do not.
9 carries. Okay, he had 9 carries. He ran for 104 yards and 3 touchdowns.
Wow.
He's over 10 yards a carry and a touchdown every third time he gets the ball on the ground last week. He's a really good running back. He and Tavion Thomas, probably the 2 best in the Pac-12. He should never run in a conference game for 104 yards on 9 carries. That should take him 15 to 20 if your defense is respectable, because UCLA knows how to run the football, and he's a tough guy to bring down. He is an NFL caliber back. He is really, really good. But 9 for 103 and 3 touchdowns. Defense hasn't been there. They try to fake punt that didn't work. The offense can't move the ball. There's nothing going right in Colorado right now.
I think the biggest thing might be some of the people like, oh, look at Matt Rule's kind of struggling in the NFL, so maybe we can throw a bunch of money at him if he gets fired or something like that. Maybe that's
I
like
think Arizona State would have a better chance at Matt Rule than
I
Colorado,
agree.
because Rule would demand a lot of money. And I
Mhm.
actually don't think Arizona State's financial situation is as lucrative as I or others may even think. That's kind of been the word along the grapevine and such. But it's certainly better than Colorado's, who didn't want to pay Mel Tucker, who, granted, is having a pretty bad start to the year. And when his teams lose, they get blown out bad. But he also won 11 games at Michigan State last year. So I think
Yeah.
he's at least a solid, respectable coach, and it is not going well for Carl Durrell and company.
Yeah, well, and you even mentioned Mel Tucker. I mean, I just really quick, like, just if you're gonna do, and I'm a Mel Tucker fan, but like some of the things, if you're gonna do that in the off season, I do think it's a bad look when you go on the road and some of those things like that, and just get blown out in a couple of
Oh, they
those
got
games.
waxed by Minnesota at
I
home.
know, I
They
know.
were in East Lansing, and they were not
And
competitive
it's a good Gophers team,
again.
but you got to be competitive. That's the
Yeah,
thing. Like, it's okay to lose these games, but like, just be competitive, especially if you're
yeah.
supposed to be back and like where those other teams are.
And that's where I'm at with Colorado. Is that I don't think anyone expected them to be good. Pac-12 media picked them to be last this year, and I did as well. But there's different levels of 1-11. Arizona last year is not the worst 1-11 team I've ever seen.
Yes.
Colorado is going to struggle to find a win this year. I hope they find one, because no fan base deserves to go 0-12. It's just a painful thing to see, and it just cannot be any fun to go through that and not have a single win all year, and then that starts to become the narrative, and that's of course what it is right now. And I don't know what their losing streak is at dating back to last year, but it's got to be approaching 10 or so, and I think they'll get beyond that because they're at Arizona this week. I don't think they win that game, but you got to just be competitive, at least in some of the games. And through 4, they've played 4 good teams. They've been noticeably worse than both than any of those teams. Week in and week out, they're worse. And so if you can find a few games where you can at least compete, that'd be nice. But I don't know where that is on the schedule. Probably Arizona State. Arizona State, and I don't know. I think that's it, because I watched Cal beat Arizona, and I'm like, well, that's a little better than I thought they were capable of being.
Yeah, and you're right too about the 0-11 thing. I wouldn't wish that on pretty much. Okay, maybe there's one team that you guys can probably figure it out. I'd be okay if they went 0-11, but outside of that, wouldn't wish it on anyone. But the huge thanks to Spencer Mclaughlin for joining us. If you guys are in the market for a second listen every day, make sure you guys do check out the Locked On Pac-12 podcast, where Spencer Mclaughlin himself and other experts will be breaking down what's going to be a fun week of games this week as well, right,
How about
Spencer?
the golf tan line right there?
Yeah,
Look at that. Yeah, that's sorry.
been in the gym. There you go.
No, I'm not in the gym. I go to the driving range. I don't touch
Yeah.
weights. I go to the range, but I tell you what, you should see my sock tan. Whew, thing is nasty.
To hear more about Spencer and his sock tan, check out Locked On Pac-12. Appreciate all you guys for joining us. Make sure you guys keep it here, as we got another fun game preview coming out tomorrow. That's it for today's episode of Locked On Utes, but we'll see you tomorrow.